please welcome Anne Robinson. So I guess maybe we should start with what brought you to the process of casting, or glass as such?
We're immediately talking about process, and we will talk about process, but not very much, because I think there's other more important, interesting things to talk about. But what brought me to casting was at art school many years ago. I fell in love with bronze casting. I like fire and I like heat, and later on I became a glass blower. At some point I began working out that you should be able to cast glass in the same way that you cast bronze. So we're talking about what's called lost wax casting. So anybody who knows a bit about bronze casting will be able to have a little idea of how you cast glass. But it's a seriously modified process, because glass can't be cast in exactly the same way as bronze. So I set out to, at art school, last year at art school, I set out to modify the process of bronze casting to suit glass.
Because I think I read that glass blowing was only introduced when you went back to Elam the second time, was that right?
Yes, yeah, and glass casting
and
as
casting,
well.
yeah.
But I had previously cast bronze,
At Elam.
so lost wax casting of bronze.
And were there many other artists or students who did the casting when you were at Elam?
No, nobody. No, I mean, nobody was doing it that we knew about. It was very new in the world, and there was a movement in the States, a glass movement, as there was, beginning movements all over the world actually, but it was very strong in the States, of course, because it went into the schools and the universities, the art schools. That started over there as glass blowing, but there were a few people in the States at the same time as I was working it out in New Zealand. There were a few people casting in different ways in the States, and there was one person that I knew about, or that I was friends with in England. Colin Reid, his name is, and he's still working. What we didn't know about was that there was a huge movement of glass casting happening in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at the time, and that was under Russian domination at that time. So we just didn't know what was happening there. Mm. And later on, when the Russians left Czechoslovakia, we had very similar methods going on that we had developed ourselves without knowing about what was going on over there.
You're always described as a pioneer of this particular movement, and the experimentation that you must have done in order to get to the forms and how long the kiln process.
Yeah, I was a pioneer.
Mm.
The process that I worked out and later taught in the States was nicknamed the flower pot method. That's mine. That's mine. And that was simply because instead of having crucibles built into the mould, great big crucibles that you might put the glass in and melt down into the mould of the piece, I sat on top of the moulds a flower pot, which was a crucible, but I used Italian flower pots. Italian flower pots, ceramic flower pots, like you all know about them, all know them. And they worked really beautifully with the hole in the bottom, the glass could run in. And there seemed to be, with those Italian ones, better results. The whole process involves a whole lot more than an Italian flower pot. But it just, that's what it was called. And I noticed just lately that they're still calling it that. Mm. Although there's people that have taken my method and refined it again. So, everybody finds a method that suits what they want to make. And my method suited what I wanted to make, in that I wasn't looking at having perfect surfaces, that a lot of the surfacing of my pieces happened after they were cast, but there are people who are making smaller things, like there's somebody where there are proprietary products now that you can buy to be the first layer of the piece that, you know, will give perfect impression, like a fingerprint in the wax would come out in the glass with those products. But so my process is a process that was suited for making big, heavy work that had a lot of finishing involved, whereas a lot of people in the States didn't want to do that finishing, and I don't blame them because it's arduous actually, but they wanted to cast something that came out absolutely perfectly, but it didn't suit big pieces, it didn't suit big work. So there's a lot of very fine work, like there's Luke Jacob in New Zealand at the moment making exquisite little birds. And he's using a proprietary, you know, material that gives him fantastic finishes. I could cast one of his wax birds and it would come out differently, and we would finish it later on. You know, we would do a lot of finishing and finishing off with what's fantastic with a lead crystal glass, finishing it off with an acid polish, so a bath of acid that finished the surface. I've just seen friends of mine.
And can I ask you about the glass that you use? Because I think that was quite a big journey and experimentation to refine so that you could create these large-scale pieces. Yeah,
the glass. In the beginning, what I was doing, because I was a glass blower, that at the end of our blowing session, which, you know, you had a session, say, for 3 days, and then you had to make new glass. So you had to sort of empty the furnace of any glass that was left by ladling it out with a big metal ladle and ladling it out into water. And that's what I got to use, that glass that's ladled into water frits up. It's called a frit then, you know, it just breaks up into hundreds of billions of little pieces. And my first castings were done with our Sunbeam Glass Works frit. And so the new glass would be made, and at the end of that session I would get to ladle out anything that was left. And that was all the same recipe, that glass. So compatibility of glasses is important. If you're mixing glass from one melt with a glass from another melt, it has to be the same recipe. And of course glass, you probably don't even realise that glass has recipes, and that window glass is very different from glass that you're blowing, and glass that you're blowing is very different from Pyrex, sort of, which is a borosilicate glass, which could take terrific heat. So the glass that I ended up with was because when we broke up Sunbeam Glass Works and left, one of my partners from Sunbeam Glass Work, he moved sideways from glass blowing into glass making, and he was making glass for the glass blowers. So it's just quite a long, I'm not going to go into it too much because it would take up too much time. But anyway, that's what he did. He stopped blowing glass and he got together with another person. This is a man called John Croucher, who is a fantastic glass chemist. And they began making concentrated colour bar, it's called, for glass blowers. So we used to, as glass blowers, we used to import it from Germany. It was all made in Germany. And this company that John Croucher set up, which was called Gaffer Glass, they took over the German market. It was quite remarkable what happened in New Zealand. They made glass that was so beautifully quality controlled that people began preferring it to what was coming out of Germany, which at that point in Germany, those companies that were making glass weren't keeping control of the quality so well as they had previously. So when we were blowing glass, we were buying what was called Kugler glass. That came from Germany. That came from the Kugler company. But when Gaffer started making glass in New Zealand, it began becoming a brand that people wanted, and the Americans were buying it, Gaffer glass, and the Australians, English, it went all over the world. So at one point I talked to John Croucher about what I was finding, which was that I had had enough crystal glass from broken Dartington's glass that came from Britain. Theirs was a 24% lead crystal glass, and they used to arrive in New Zealand at the people who had licenses, who happened to be my father-in-law. These pieces would arrive broken, you know, beautiful, free-blown crystal jugs with great big handles, you know, a lot of glass. So you only had to have 2 or 3 of those broken, and you've got enough for doing a casting. And it was all the same recipe because it came from the same factory. And my first casting with a lead crystal glass that my father-in-law kept for me under his desk. He had a waste paper basket, and he used to put the broken pieces in there. It was a dream. The casting was a dream. It looked better. I always knew when I was using the sunbeam glass, the soda lime glass that we used to blow, it wasn't right. And it wasn't right for casting, and it had to be melted at a much higher temperature. So a lead crystal brought the temperature down. We could do our castings at a much lower temperature. And so there was less danger of moulds breaking because you weren't firing up into those high ranges. There was less problem of a thing that happens with glass, which is called devitrification, where it goes cloudy, where it forms crystals. And so at a lower temperature, none of these problems happened, and the colours were very rich and exquisite, which is the thing that's known about lead crystal. Is that they say it saturates with colour. So the chemicals, the oxides that you use for colouring, like, you know, for instance, cobalt makes that rich blue that we all know from milk with magnesia bottles. And, you know, so there's all these oxides. Well, they say that lead crystal has got the ability to saturate. I don't quite know what that means, but it just means that the colours are rich and exquisite compared with if you tried to put those when you put those colours into soda lime glass that you might blow, in which case it will look lovely when it's blown, but, you know, there's something special about the lead crystal. So that's briefly about, you know, the process.
And you experimented with the percentage of lead crystal, is that right? To get the perfect...
Well, yeah. I didn't do that. Gaffer, when I said to John Croucher, what I need is a lead crystal glass, there's none in New Zealand available. He said, oh, we should be able to make lead crystal glass for you. So they started thinking that I was going to be the only one that was going to be using it. So I would have had to have taken a whole furnace of one colour. But they did start making glass, and for the first year I tested it. And for the first year it didn't work very well. It looked beautiful, but the pieces kept cracking. And it took quite a long time. And I was reporting back to them, and they were saying, it shouldn't be doing that, shouldn't be doing that. And I'm saying, it is doing that. What I was doing was casting the same piece in the same way, so that there was only one variable, the glass. And when it came out of the mould, it might be perfect, and you began working it, and little cracks began happening throughout the pieces. And that happened sufficiently with me testing it that I could go back to Gaffer and say, no, it's not right yet, there's something not right. And they worked out what that was. So they were the ones that decided it was going to be a 45% lead crystal that they were doing, which was really, really high. Like, lead crystal is just a brand name. It isn't a crystal from the ground. Lead crystal just means it's got crystal in it and it's over, and I think to qualify to be called lead crystal, to be called a crystal glass, the lead component had to be like something over maybe 18%. I'm not exactly sure, it could be 20%, 24%, but so a crystal glass with 45% is seriously crystal glass. And the lead in it, of course, is the thing that lowers the melting quality. It lowers the melting temperature. Are you with me? Sort of, it's quite technical glass. You don't get something for nothing with glass. You know, you work for everything you get out of it. It's a very unforgiving material. It doesn't bend at all. It breaks.
Can I ask you about setting up your studio and moving out to set that up, and what impact that had on your works?
I had quite a few studios at different times. While I was glass blowing, I had my laundry at home, and I was experimenting because I had started this experimenting at art school. Then I left art school and joined Sunbeam Glassworks, bought into Sunbeam Glassworks. So it's myself, Gary Nash and John Croucher. You probably know these names because John and Gary were lovely glass blowers and they were very clever. So I was very lucky in that I became partners to two men who were very good at understanding how to melt glass and how to build a glassworks, how to build the furnitures. So I was the person that rushed around the edges, being as helpful as I could be, because I could never have done that by myself. So I'm eternally grateful for, you know, that step into glass. After 9 years together as Sunbeam Glassworks, we sort of went apart. We separated out and went and did other things. And I did too, you know. And I, at that point, because I'd been taking glass home from the Sunbeam furnace at the end of one of our sessions, you know, I had all of this crushed up glass. And I was experimenting with casting. I kept experimenting. I kept the experiments up that I was doing at art school. So I was actually beginning to understand what it was that I was doing. In the beginning, I didn't have a clue. I used to put little moulds in a kiln that I had at the art school and put the glass in and then heat it up as high as I could get it. And then one day, I met John Croucher by chance, and John Croucher had an ability to be really interested in what people were doing. So he was questioning, we didn't know each other, it was the first time I met him, and I was saying the moulds keep breaking, you know, and he said, but do you have to fire that high? And he said, because glass is liquid at a much lower point, and it will run, you know, at round about 700 degrees. And I didn't know that, but neither did my tutor tell me that about glass. I mean, I didn't know anything. And from then on, I experimented with firing at lower temperatures, which of course worked. And the mould stopped breaking.
Did you want to briefly talk about the two pieces we have in the auction? So we have the earlier piece, which is 1995, and then the piece behind, which is 2017.
I went through a lot of designs, you know, and the process was that you made in another material what you wanted to make, but I was mostly using wax, but I could have used clay. But for different reasons, I didn't use clay, but I used wax. And so I was carving and making shapes and pouring the wax in and making a round bowl and then cutting the round bowl in half and taking a section out of the middle and putting it back together again. And what do you get? You get an oval bowl. That was really exciting. So I was playing with forms. I was working out forms. I always had quite a classical attitude towards films in that I didn't want to do the sort of funky sort of things that people were doing in pottery, or that I wanted to do things that stood straight and were classical and regular and mathematical, actually. I think I'm sort of have got quite a strong connection to mathematics, and that's helped me a lot, because one of the things that I had to work out once I began casting, and once I began casting thick things, you can't just let glass cool because it breaks. So glass has to be annealed, and that means that you have to calculate the thickest part of the piece that you're making, which might be the foot or the bottom of that. So it gets to be about 3 inches. You have to calculate it mathematically. You know, you have to take into account factors that the glass itself carries, like its expansion and contraction rate, which this glass is 90. But it's one of the factors you put into a whole calculation. Now that pursuing of annealing, that's one of the things that by chance I was able to do in league with working with John Croucher, who was the real scientist, but he found the tables that I could put the different factors that were required to know, like the thickness, the expansion and contraction of the glass, and various other factors. You can work out a cooling table. And it might go something like this, like after you've fired the glass up there to the top temperature, which was once something that you experimented with, I pulled a little plug that was in that flower pot. I pulled a plug by putting a metal thing into the kiln and getting hold of a wire and pulling a plug out, and then the glass would run down. And then once the glass was in the mould and overflowing and all sitting there looking really nice and full and the mould not broken, then you begin cooling. And so what you do is you drop the temperature. You can drop the temperature quite quickly to a point that's called the annealing point. And from the annealing point to the top annealing point to the bottom annealing point, you go really, really slowly. And you cool that piece so that the outside temperature and the inside of the thickest part are the same. So the inside will drop naturally, but the outside has to be kept. You can't let the outside drop because it'll drop faster. So you have to program a kiln to keep injecting little bits of heat into the kiln so that the inside and the outside of that thick bit of glass is coming down together and there's no stress. If the outside comes down faster, the piece goes, you know, and it mightn't break in the kiln, but it will break later. It mightn't break for 6 months, but it won't be properly annealed. So you're coming down at temperatures like 1 degree an hour through that range. Once you're through that range, you can go fast again. So it's very complex annealing, and it's very interesting. I always kept records of everything I was doing, but in the end, and I brought along, I'm just going to show you a little bit. This is my last book, keeping records of my firings, and so I do something like this. So I'd be firing, this is probably the same piece, it's just a different light situation. But so I'd write up what I had done, what the firing was, what the piece was, what the thickness was. I'd write up all the details so that every firing I did, I just kept records. And this is the very last book. So it's quite thorough, like they got more and more thorough as time went on. And so I could always go back and find a piece and work out, if somebody ever came back to me and said, it just broke really unexpectedly, which actually has never happened. But, you know, if something began happening in that wasn't actually a break, but something was wrong with the piece, I could go back to my records and I could think, what am I doing? What was I doing there that didn't work? Or what was I doing there that did work that isn't working now? And I could go back over quite long periods of what I was doing and work out something that allowed me to change what I was doing and to get the results that I wanted. So these books are sort of full of notes, but they are, you can sort of see that I at this point, at the last, this is the last stage of my sort of life as scholar. So I was actually moving through, I was making at one point a whole lot of different things. Now, the reason for that is that I might make this piece, which is a very thick piece. See, you can see that one, very thick, even up here at the top. You can see on the top, that's the top rim, which I sandblasted with these ribs of leaves across the top, across that shiny top. But at this point, we were actually shining up the rim quite often. In the beginning, I didn't know how to shine up glass. And it's painful, and to shine it up with no scratches in it. But over a working life of maybe 30 years, maybe a bit more than 30 years, we became very, very skilled. And when I say we, I'm talking about my team, because I always had fantastic people working for me. So we became very good at, very skilled at all of that finishing, which was what, is important for my work. But when you're making one piece that's very thick, it's in the kiln maybe for 2 weeks. And so while you're doing that, you're finishing other pieces that have come out of the kiln for the last firing. And I had three kilns going at one point. And so at the same time, over the time when you're waiting, like when you, that you can make new waxes and you can design new pieces. And so slowly over a period of 30 years, I gathered up a lot of designs, and I could always go back to a design and do it again and modify it. And that was the thing that was really nice about using wax, is that you could make a wax that was a particular form, like that one that I just showed you, and you could decide to change it, or like that piece there, where I made it as a round piece first, and I thought, I wonder what would happen if I cut it in half. And you could do that with the wax. You can cut it in half and melt out a section in the middle and put it back together and think, that's really interesting. Or the other piece that I just showed you, that very geometric piece, like I actually lay in bed and thought, I wonder what it would be like if I made a piece that was 100 mil by 100 mil square on the base, and 300 mil by 300 mil square at the top. So a square at the top and a square at the back, and then join it with a line, some sort of line, like the line could be like that. Or, so the first one I did was just joining them up with a curve. Or you could go from one corner to the next corner at the bottom, so that curve could go around, the piece could have that. But I always made myself do the first idea first. I always said that to the people who were with me, do the first idea first. Don't, because immediately you have an idea, you begin seeing where that idea could go to. But so I always had a lot of work on the go, like there were waxes that were coming along, and I might have someone in the studio who was working on waxes, or who's really good at working on the waxes. So I would always make the moulds with one of them, because we could make the moulds quite fast, and I always thought that was an area that I should keep to myself because it was so important. Then I had people who were really good at finishing, and some of those guys got better than me at the finishing of pieces. And then I used to put them in the acid. Well, eventually I got somebody else to do that too, because I was very careless. And it's a very dangerous acid that you use to polish glass. So the acid doesn't exactly polish it, but it gives it seals the surface so that it doesn't get finger marked anymore. A lot of people don't use acid because it is very dangerous, and so they might use some product, like a polish of some sort. but I always worried that that was going to interact with the glass and eventually cause the glass to deform in some way. Not deform, but maybe become opaque, something like that. And there did seem to be some evidence that that could happen, so I always stuck to putting the work in the acid to seal the surface. And that's how crystal is finished overseas, you know, like that Dartington's crystal. They, those big glassworks, they have big metal frames, or whatever the frames are made of, I don't know. And, you know, they might have a whole lot of the same thing, and it went into the acid for 3 minutes. It was seriously concentrated acid, and it would come out and it would be glossy. But I wasn't prepared to use acid of that strength, so I used a sort of 10% acid, and so my pieces went in for 2 or 3 hours. And they'd come out with a white film all over them, and you'd wash that off, and underneath it would be, you know, that lovely soft gloss that I came to see that that's how I wanted my work to be. I wanted it to have a soft gloss. I didn't want it to be highly polished, as the tops are. I didn't want to actually look through the piece. I didn't want to be able to see what was going on the other side, and reflections from all over behind me, or see myself reflected in taking a photo of the piece. You know, like, I like the mystery of the soft finish. So this was in an exhibition at Artists Gallery a couple of years ago, and that piece is 45 kilos in weight. It's not that big, it's about 550 by 550, isn't it, Grace? Grace has probably carried it.
Yep. I don't know how you carried most of them, they're very heavy.
So when it came out of the mould, it was sort of fairly rough because the glass had been up against it. So we actually worked the surface with grinders and polishers and diamond tools, and then we cut the surface, which was straight across. We cut it to slope down. But I had already done one of these before where we cut it in another way, and so that whole piece sort of did the opposite. It sloped down at the points, whereas this one's, the lowest point is that little square in the middle. And I called them light wheels because they were getting to the point where they weren't really usable pieces. And I realised that the hole in the middle was letting the light in. And that was a big thing. Like, I began getting into the idea of penetrating the masses of glass with a hole that let the light in. That's when I stopped. And I didn't mean to stop. But my life went haywire, and I stopped casting, and that's more or less the last piece that I was doing. I'm really glad I got to do it. Even in the process of doing this piece, I don't know whether you can see, there's this, on the edge, there's a flat bit that's a long triangle that comes back to being the triangle again. We didn't know that it was going to do that. You know, I was saying to Brett, I want you to cut it like this, and I want you to leave these ridges here. So each cut on the top was a scoop, and it met at the corners. So there was a scoop, and it was a sloping scoop. It went down to the lip. So it was complicated. So there were hundreds of things that you could do with this piece. There was so much that could be done with that piece. And I'm really sorry, you know, like I'm not going to be doing them. But it was like that with every piece. You know, you began making it and you began thinking, like the geometric vase that I showed you, the square 300 down to 100, and the hole in the middle was 100 as well. So it's a mathematical thing. Geometry was my favourite subject at school. And so, you know, like I lay in bed and I thought about geometric shapes. But then the bubbles collected on the corners sometimes. When we got bubbly glass, which we couldn't do too much about, so occasionally we got from Gaffer even, you know, bubbly glass, Well, it might mean that the bubbles collect somewhere. If you're thinking of casting, you're thinking upside down, the piece is upside down, and the glass is going in the foot and down to into the vase. Well, the bubbles rise up and they catch in a corner. Well, I didn't like the look of those bubbles. It made it look raggedy on the corner. So I began slicing the corner off, cutting the corner. And what I found was happening was this beautiful leaf shape would appear on the piece. I just that was a magic to me, that you could make a geometric form, a really strong geometric form, and you could cut into it and it became an organic form.
Well, I think we'll leave it there if that's
Oh,
all right.
bye-bye.
But Anne will be here. So can you please thank you, Anne, for the tour.